Tragic reminder of the power of obsession and the destructive nature of infidelity. It was a story of love turned toxic. But before we proceed, kindly let us know in the comment below where you are watching us from. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled away from the bustling heart of the city, lived a family that appeared to be just like any other, peaceful, loving, and seemingly content. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect home, a dark secret was festering, one that would end in violence and tragedy. Lori Montgomery, a 34-year-old wife and mother of two, was a woman known for her warmth and kindness. Friends described her as the type of person who always had a smile on her face and a helping hand for anyone in need. A devoted mother and wife, she had been married to her husband, Thomas Montgomery, for over a decade. They lived in a two-story house on Oak Ridge Lane, a street where neighbors knew each other by name and children played freely on the sidewalks. But as often is the case in these stories, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the closed doors of the Montgomery home, there were cracks forming in the marriage. The distance between Lori and Thomas had grown over the past year. What seemed to be subtle at first, a quiet dinner, fewer shared conversations, an increasing number of late nights at work, soon began to turn into something far more troubling. As Thomas became more withdrawn, Lori noticed a strange shift. It wasn't just his behavior at home. It was his sudden fondness for socializing with the new neighbor. The new neighbor, a woman named Rachel Hayes, had recently moved in next door. Rachel was 28 years old, charming, intelligent, and undeniably attractive. She had quickly struck up a friendly relationship with Thomas, and it wasn't long before their friendship seemed to turn into something more. Rachel's presence was unassuming at first. She often brought over casseroles or baked goods, always finding reasons to drop by to visit Lori and the children. But it was Thomas she seemed most drawn to. As weeks passed, Lori began to notice the way Rachel's visits had become more frequent, the way Thomas seemed more eager to see her than he did to spend time with his own wife. Lori couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At first, she chalked it up to stress. After all, Thomas had been working long hours at the law firm where he was a partner. But the gut feeling she had grew stronger as time went on, and her suspicions deepened. One night, as she was folding laundry in the living room, she overheard a conversation that confirmed her worst fears. From the other room, she could hear snippets of a phone conversation. Thomas's voice was lower than usual, filled with a tenderness that Lori had not heard in months. Rachel's voice, though muffled, was unmistakably flirtatious. Lori's heart sank. It wasn't just friendship, it was an affair. The discovery left Lori devastated. The life she had built with Thomas, the family, the home, was unraveling before her eyes. But it wasn't just the affair that would haunt her. It was the way it would ultimately spiral out of control. Rachel Hayes, the woman who had appeared so friendly and charming, was no longer just a neighbor. She was now a threat. And unbeknownst to Lori, Rachel had a deadly plan to take what she believed was rightfully hers. Thomas. The calm suburban life that Lori had known was about to be shattered. Lori had no idea that her world was about to implode. The following weeks were marked by a growing tension in the Montgomery household. Lori, now aware of her husband's betrayal, struggled to navigate the complicated emotions that came with discovering her husband's affair. The heartache of being replaced, of no longer being enough for the man she had married, was suffocating. But Lori was determined to confront the situation. She wasn't going to let this betrayal define her. But before Lori could address the affair head-on, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The woman behind Thomas's newfound affection was Rachel Hayes, the same neighbor who had charmed her with her warm smile and casserole dishes. Rachel, however, wasn't content with being the other woman in the shadows. She wanted more, much more. Rachel's initial attempts at playing the role of the friendly, unobtrusive neighbor began to shift. She grew bolder, more assertive in her interactions with Thomas. She would show up at his office unannounced, lingering at his door with a suggestive smile, inviting him to casual lunches or walks in the park. When he began to turn down her invitations, Rachel would make sure to remind him of all the things Lori wasn't giving him, things she herself would gladly provide. Rachel's words were calculated, her charm seemingly endless. She knew how to make Thomas feel desired, how to give him the validation that Lori had been unable to offer in recent months. Rachel made him feel like the man he used to be, The man who had once been carefree and passionate before responsibilities and the weight of family life had taken their toll. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was a psychological hold she had on him. But the reality of the situation hit Thomas hard. He was caught in a web of guilt, love, and desire. He knew what he was doing to his family, yet the allure of Rachel's attention was intoxicating. Lori, the woman he had promised to cherish, had become a shadow in his mind, a reminder of everything that was wrong in his life. Rachel, on the other hand, represented something new, something exciting. For Lori, the slow-burning pain of watching her marriage crumble was unbearable. She questioned herself, wondering if she had somehow failed Thomas. Was she not enough? Had her busy schedule with the children, the house, and her own commitments pushed him into the arms of another woman? Her self-esteem plummeted, and in the deep recesses of her mind, she began to entertain the thought of divorce. But as much as she wanted to save her marriage, she knew she couldn't force someone to love her if their heart had already wandered. As the affair continued, the tension between Thomas and Lori grew unbearable. Arguments became more frequent, their once peaceful home now echoing with anger and resentment. Lori confronted Thomas about his infidelity, demanding the truth. At first, Thomas denied everything, lying through clenched teeth, but Lori had already seen enough. She had heard enough. She knew. And with a quiet, heartbreaking resolve, she told him she knew about Rachel. Thomas was caught in a storm of emotions. He loved Lori, but he was enamored with Rachel. In that moment, he confessed everything. He told Lori about the affair and how it had gone on for months. It was a blow that left her reeling, but it also gave her clarity. She had been living in a fog, unsure of what was happening. Now she had answers, even if they were not the ones she wanted. Lori demanded that Thomas end the affair immediately. But Rachel, it seemed, wasn't a woman who was used to being told no. She had no intention of stepping back, and she wasn't about to let Thomas go without a fight. And it was in that fight that the seeds of something far more sinister were planted. Rachel was no longer content with playing the role of the mistress. She was tired of being second place. She wanted Thomas, and she wanted him at any cost. Lori's demands only fueled her desire. In Rachel's mind, there was only one way to get rid of the obstacle standing in her path, the woman she saw as nothing more than a rival. The neighbors, oblivious to the turmoil inside the Montgomery household, continued to live their lives. But Rachel, who had once been just another friendly face in the neighborhood, was now a woman on a mission. And that mission would soon escalate to something far darker than anyone could have imagined. In the days that followed the confrontation between Thomas and Lori, the dynamics of the Montgomery household shifted dramatically. The tension between the married couple was palpable. They could no longer look at each other without the weight of the affair looming over them. Their home, once a place of comfort and love, had become a battleground for emotions. Lori tried to keep things normal for the sake of the children, but the cracks in her marriage were deep, and the sadness that hung in the air could not be ignored. Thomas, meanwhile, was consumed by guilt. His love for Lori was still there, but his desire for Rachel was undeniable. He found himself caught between two worlds, one with the woman who had given him a family, and the other with the woman who promised him a life full of excitement and passion. But as the days passed, he began to grow uneasy with his role in this tangled mess. The guilt was eating him alive, and he knew that something had to give. It was during this period of inner turmoil that Rachel's behavior became increasingly erratic. She began showing up at Thomas's office even more often, trying to insert herself into his life in any way she could. She no longer kept her distance, and the manipulative words she used to lure him into her web began to take on a darker tone. Rachel was no longer the sweet, misunderstood woman who had simply fallen in love with a married man. She had become desperate. The once charming neighbor now appeared like a woman on the edge of a dangerous precipice. What had started as an affair was slowly morphing into a fixation, an obsession. Rachel wanted Thomas, and she wanted him at all costs. But what she didn't anticipate was how far she would be willing to go to achieve her goal. Rachel began to fantasize about a life with Thomas, a life where she was no longer the other woman, but the one and only. But there was one thing standing in her way: Lori. In Rachel's mind, Lori was no longer just a wife. She was an obstacle. She was an obstacle that needed to be removed for Rachel's dream to become a reality. But Rachel knew she couldn't simply ask Thomas to leave his wife. That would never work. No, she had to find a way to make sure Lori was gone for good. In the isolation of her home, Rachel began to obsess over the details of the Montgomerys' lives. She would drive by their house at odd hours, making sure to memorize every window, every door, every light that flickered at night. She watched them from a distance, plotting the perfect moment to strike. As Rachel's thoughts turned darker, she began to reach out to people who could help her carry out her plan. She started speaking to men in the neighborhood, men who were known for their rough edges, men who lived on the fringes of society. They didn't ask questions. They just did what they were paid to do. Rachel, with her beauty and charm, used her allure to convince them to help her. She knew what she wanted, and nothing was going to stop her from getting it. The details of Rachel's plot began to fall into place. She had already scoped out Lori's routine, how she would take the kids to school in the morning, how she would run errands during the day, and how she always seemed to be home at night when Thomas was out at work or meeting Rachel. Rachel knew the perfect time to act. Lori, in her mind, was just a pawn in a much larger game, a game she was about to win. The murder was meticulously planned. Rachel was careful not to draw attention to herself. She made sure the men she hired were discreet, that they understood exactly what needed to be done. She kept herself cool and collected, masking her desperation behind a facade of charm. But as the days passed, she could feel the excitement building inside her. The plan was set into motion, and nothing could stop it now. Lori, for her part, had no idea of the danger that was rapidly approaching. She was still grappling with the betrayal of her husband, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage their family. She had no idea that the person she had once called a neighbor, a friend, was plotting her death. She had no idea that the woman who had once shared smiles and pleasantries with her was now someone capable of taking everything from her, including her life. As Rachel's plans neared fruition, she began to feel a sense of excitement mixed with fear. There was no turning back now. The only thing that mattered was getting what she wanted. But little did she know, someone was already starting to notice the strange behavior, the unusual activity around the Montgomery household. A neighbor had begun to watch her closely, raising suspicions that would soon come to light. It was a crisp autumn evening when Rachel Hayes finally set her plan into motion. The evening seemed ordinary enough. Cool air carrying the scent of fallen leaves through the neighborhood, children playing in their front yards, and families enjoying dinner together. But for Rachel, this would be no ordinary night. Tonight, everything she had worked for, the meticulous planning, the lies, the manipulation, would come to a head. Tonight, she would have what she wanted. Lori Montgomery, unaware of the looming danger, was in her kitchen preparing dinner for her two children. Thomas was late again. He had been working long hours at his law firm, but Lori could sense the distance between them. Her heart ached as she tried to piece together the shattered remnants of her once happy life. It had been weeks since she had confronted Thomas about the affair, and though he had promised to end it, she could see the lingering tension in his eyes. He was still seeing Rachel. Of that, she was certain. She made an effort to be strong, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her children's sake. But the unease was growing. It wasn't just the affair anymore. Lori felt as though her entire world was slipping through her fingers, and her instincts were telling her that something was terribly wrong. As the evening went on, the Montgomery family's routine continued as usual. The children sat at the dinner table, chattering about their day while Lori moved around the kitchen. She smiled, trying to mask the sadness that had settled deep within her. But her smile faded when the doorbell rang. When she opened the door, she was greeted not by Thomas, but by Rachel Hayes. "Oh, hi, Rachel," Lori said, surprised but trying to maintain a cordial tone. "Is everything okay?" Rachel, standing in the doorway with an innocent smile, looked almost too casual for the situation. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in on you. I know things have been tough with Thomas, and I just wanted to make sure you're doing all right." Lori's stomach twisted at Rachel's words. She had no idea how to respond. There was no way Rachel could know what had happened between her and Thomas. Or so she thought. "I'm fine, thank you," Lori replied, her voice a little stiff. "I'm just trying to keep things together for the kids." Rachel nodded, still wearing that same calculated smile. "You're doing a great job," she said, her tone sweet and patronizing. "If you ever need anything, just let me know. I'm here for you." Lori, feeling uneasy, managed a tight smile before saying goodbye to Rachel, who waved and walked away. What Lori didn't know was that Rachel wasn't really concerned about her well-being. In fact, she was already moving into position. Rachel had been watching Lori closely, timing everything perfectly. Rachel had contacted the men who were supposed to carry out the murder. They were waiting just down the street, in the shadows of the quiet neighborhood. The plan was simple. When Lori was alone, she would be attacked. The men would enter through the back door, incapacitate Lori, and make sure she didn't leave the house alive. They would make it look like a random burglary gone wrong, an unfortunate but believable explanation for her death. But the night didn't go exactly as Rachel had planned. Lori had just finished putting the children to bed when she heard a noise outside. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made her skin crawl. She stood still, trying to listen for anything that might explain the sound. She glanced around the house, unsure of what she was hearing. A few minutes passed, and then she heard it again, louder this time. The sound of footsteps. Her heart raced. Could it be Thomas, finally home? But no, the footsteps were coming from behind the house. Lori's breath hitched as she moved cautiously toward the kitchen window, peeking outside. That's when she saw them. Two shadowy figures moving swiftly in the darkness. Her mind raced and her heart skipped a beat. Panic gripped her chest. She quickly backed away from the window, her hands shaking as she grabbed the phone. She needed to call Thomas, but her fingers fumbled in the panic. She could feel something was terribly wrong. The feeling in her gut, the fear crawling up her spine, it was undeniable. She knew she had to get the children to safety, but before she could make the call, the back door burst open with a violent crash. A man entered, his face masked, his presence overpowering. Lori screamed, rushing toward the children's room, but another figure emerged from the shadows, blocking her path. It was too late. The door slammed shut behind her. A struggle ensued, chaos unfolding in the Montgomery home as Lori fought for her life. Desperate, she tried to scream, but her voice was drowned out by the harsh sound of footsteps and shouting. Her attempts to defend herself were futile against the attackers. They overpowered her, and within moments, she was knocked unconscious. The two men made sure that Lori's life was taken before disappearing into the night. They left the scene as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the broken remnants of a family's tragic fate. In the minutes that followed, Thomas arrived home to a scene of unimaginable horror. He entered through the front door, completely unaware of what had transpired behind him. It wasn't until he reached the staircase that he saw the blood. His heart stopped as he rushed up to the bedroom, calling out to Lori in panic. But there was no answer, just the chilling silence that followed. Thomas found Lori, lifeless on the floor. The aftermath of Lori Montgomery's murder was immediate and devastating. The quiet suburban neighborhood, once a place of warmth and security, was now enveloped in grief and disbelief. Neighbors gathered outside their homes, whispering in shock as police cars and ambulances lined Oak Ridge Lane. The peaceful street, where families once greeted each other with smiles, had become the scene of a brutal crime, a crime that would haunt the community for years to come. Inside the Montgomery home, detectives scoured the scene for evidence. It was clear that this was no random act of violence. The brutality of the attack, the methodical way in which Lori had been incapacitated and left for dead, spoke to a level of planning, a calculated effort to silence her. This wasn't just a burglary gone wrong. Someone had wanted Lori dead. Detective Sarah Thompson, an experienced investigator with the local police force, was called to the scene. She immediately took charge, her mind racing through the possible scenarios. She knew that solving this case would require a deep dive into the lives of those closest to Lori, and that meant starting with her husband, Thomas Montgomery. At first, Thomas's reaction seemed genuine, shocked, devastated, and completely lost. He had arrived home to find his wife dead, a sight no one should ever have to witness. His tears, his confusion, were all too real. But Detective Thompson was trained to look beyond the surface. There was something in his eyes, something that didn't sit right with her. "Where were you tonight?" she asked, keeping her tone professional but piercing. "I was at work," Thomas replied, his voice shaking. "I didn't get home until it was too late." I had no idea what was happening. His alibi checked out. Thomas had been at the law firm, and his co-workers confirmed that he had been there most of the evening, working late into the night. But despite his alibi, Detective Thompson couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. The way Thomas avoided certain questions, the way he seemed to deflect when asked about his relationship with Rachel, everything was just a little too calculated. But it wasn't just Thomas who was under suspicion. As Detective Thompson delved deeper into the lives of the Montgomerys, she uncovered the affair. Rachel Hayes, the neighbor, Thomas's lover. Detective Thompson wasted no time in bringing Rachel in for questioning. Rachel had been a close friend of Lori's, which made her involvement in the case all the more suspicious. How could someone who had played the role of a compassionate neighbor turn into a potential killer? When Rachel was brought in for questioning, her demeanor was calm, almost too calm. She appeared composed, perhaps even a little too composed for someone whose neighbor had just been murdered. Her answers were rehearsed, her responses measured. She denied any involvement in Lori's death, claiming that she had no idea what had happened. "I was just trying to be a friend to Lori," Rachel explained, her voice soft, almost soothing. "She was going through a rough time with Thomas. I wanted to help her. I would never hurt her." Detective Thompson wasn't convinced. There was something about Rachel's answers that didn't match the evidence. Rachel's movements were too perfect, her alibi too neat. She had a tendency to gloss over specific details, details that would have been crucial for a witness. But there was no direct evidence linking Rachel to the crime, not yet. The investigators knew they had to be patient. They had to piece together every detail, from the timeline of the murder to the relationships between those involved. Meanwhile, the community was buzzing with rumors. Friends, family, and neighbors all whispered about the affair between Thomas and Rachel, the suspicious circumstances of Lori's death, and the shattered family left behind. The media had descended on Oak Ridge Lane, and the case became a topic of heated discussions across the city. As the investigation continued, it was clear that the affair was central to the case, but detectives also began to focus on another element: the unusual behavior of the men Rachel had been associating with. They weren't just neighbors or friends, they were criminals with a history of violence. Detective Thompson knew that unraveling Rachel's connection to these men was crucial. She wasn't just a lover, she was now a suspect in a murder plot. And as the pieces began to come together, the picture of a cold, calculated woman emerged. Rachel had been planning this for months, using Thomas as her pawn, manipulating him until she had him where she wanted him, at her mercy. But the most chilling part of the investigation came when the detectives discovered that Rachel's plan wasn't just about getting Thomas, it was about completely removing Lori from the picture. She wanted to take everything from her husband, her life, her family. As the evidence mounted, the detectives knew they had a case that would shock the world. Rachel Hayes, the woman who had once been seen as a sweet neighbor, was now the prime suspect in a brutal murder. The investigation was far from over, but it was clear. Lori Montgomery's life had been taken because of jealousy, obsession, and a twisted sense of entitlement. And Rachel Hayes had played a far more sinister role in the events of that night than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Lori Montgomery's murder had reached a critical juncture. The quiet suburban neighborhood, once so untouched by tragedy, had become ground zero for a case that would grip the entire city. Detective Sarah Thompson, having followed the thread of suspicion with unwavering focus, had connected the dots. Rachel Hayes, the seemingly innocent neighbor, was not only involved in the affair with Thomas Montgomery, but had orchestrated the murder of his wife in a cold and calculated attempt to claim him as her own. But even with the evidence stacking up, the legal process would now take center stage. As Rachel Hayes was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, the case would move from investigation to courtroom drama, where the lives of everyone involved would be on display. And as the trial date approached, the community braced itself for the shocking revelations that would unfold in the days to come. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Media cameras flashed, capturing every moment as the proceedings began. Thomas Montgomery sat quietly, his face a mask of grief and confusion. The man who had lost his wife was now watching his lover, the woman who had torn his family apart, stand trial for that very crime. Rachel Hayes, once a charming and warm neighbor, now appeared every bit the cold, calculating woman that the investigation had uncovered. Her eyes, which had once been filled with so much charm, were now hard and distant. Her defense team argued that Rachel had no role in Lori Montgomery's death. They claimed that she was simply a victim of a troubled affair and had no knowledge of any plans to harm Lori. But the prosecution laid out a very different story. The evidence against Rachel was overwhelming. From the communications between her and the hired men to her obsessive behavior towards Thomas, everything pointed to a woman who was willing to go to any length to have him. Rachel's love for Thomas, the prosecution argued, had turned into a dangerous obsession. She had used her charm and manipulation to draw him in, making him feel wanted and validated, especially at a time when his marriage to Lori was strained. But Rachel's desire for him went beyond love. She had envisioned a life with him, and in her twisted mind, that life could only exist if Lori was out of the picture. The prosecution painted Rachel as someone who had meticulously planned the murder for months. They revealed that Rachel had been seen numerous times lurking around the Montgomery home, keeping tabs on Lori's schedule, and even reaching out to men with criminal backgrounds who could help her carry out her deadly plan. Rachel Hayes didn't just kill Lori Montgomery, she murdered her in cold blood to get what she wanted, the prosecutor argued, his voice steady and forceful. She planned this, she executed it, and she watched as a family was destroyed because she couldn't bear to be the other woman any longer. The courtroom was gripped in silence as the evidence was laid bare. Photos of the crime scene reconstruction, and the testimonies of witnesses who had seen Rachel's strange behavior all pointed toward one chilling conclusion. Rachel Hayes had murdered Lori Montgomery in cold blood, driven by jealousy and the desire to take what she believed was hers. But it wasn't just Rachel who had to answer for the murder. Thomas Montgomery's role in the affair and his complicity in Rachel's actions came under scrutiny as well. While he was not charged with any crime, his actions and his failure to protect his wife would be a central topic throughout the trial. Thomas had allowed his affair with Rachel to continue for months, and his ignorance, or willful blindness, to her increasingly erratic behavior ultimately led to Lori's death. As the trial continued, the emotional toll on the families involved became clear. Lori's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with sorrow and disbelief. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a mother, and no amount of legal proceedings could ever bring her back. For them, the trial was not just about seeking justice, it was about finding some semblance of closure. But for Thomas, the guilt was crushing. He had not only lost his wife, but was now witnessing the destruction of his family and the devastation his actions had caused. In his heart, he had loved Lori, but his selfishness and weakness had ultimately cost her her life. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments were made. The jury deliberated for several days, and when they finally returned, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Everyone knew the gravity of what had transpired. The future of Rachel Hayes and the Montgomery family's hopes for closure hung in the balance. "Guilty," the foreman announced. "Guilty of first-degree murder." Rachel Hayes was led away in handcuffs as the room erupted in mixed emotions. For some, the verdict was a sense of justice served. For others, it was a grim reminder of how easily lives could be destroyed by deceit and obsession. Rachel's sentencing came several weeks later, and she was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her dreams of a life with Thomas Montgomery had been shattered in an instant. The affair that had once seemed so exciting and full of promise had now left her with a lifetime of regret and the heavy weight of a crime that could never be undone. The aftermath of Lori Montgomery's murder left an indelible mark on the community. Oak Ridge Lane, once a peaceful place where neighbors knew each other's names, would never be the same. The residents of the quiet neighborhood had been forced to confront the darkness that could lie beneath the most ordinary of surfaces. For Thomas Montgomery, the road to redemption would be long and fraught with pain. He had lost his wife and destroyed his family, and now he had to find a way to live with the consequences of his actions. His relationship with his children was strained as they struggled to understand what had happened. The damage to the family was irreparable, and no amount of guilt or remorse could change that. But for Lori Montgomery's family, the grief would never fully go away. They would continue to mourn the loss of a woman whose only crime had been loving her husband, whose only fault had been trusting him. In the end, the case of Lori Montgomery was a tragic reminder of the power of obsession and the destructive nature of infidelity. It was a story of love turned toxic, of a family shattered by a secret that no one ever expected. And for the people who lived on Oak Ridge Lane, it would always be a haunting memory of the night when everything changed. This concludes the story of the tragic murder of Lori Montgomery. While justice was served, the scars left by the events of that night would last a lifetime.